Hello again. My name is Steve Hillis, and this is one of a continuing series of videos on crime, criminology, criminological theories. In this video, we're going to look at a bunch of criminological factoids. Really what we're looking at is crime trends and patterns. And one of the take-home messages here is that crime has rhythms, crime has patterns, crime has structure. And we're going to look at some of those patterns, trends, and structures right now, some of those rhythms. Let's start out with rhythms and talk a little bit about our little crime clock. This crime clock kind of gives you a sense of how frequent different kinds of crimes are. If we start out looking at violent crimes, oh, by the way, we're looking at data here from 2007. This is UCR data from the FBI. They were estimating back in 2007 something like one violent crime every 22.4 seconds, one murder every 31 minutes, one rape every 5.8 minutes, one robbery every 1.2 minutes, and finally one aggravated assault every 36.8 seconds. Clearly, some types of violent crime are a whole lot more common than others. As a general rule, violent crimes tend to be a lot less common than property crimes. Sorry about the typo here. It should not say property crimes. It should say property crimes. One property crime for every 3.2 seconds. Compare that to one violent crime every 22.4 seconds. Again, property crimes much more common, much more frequent. One burglary every 14.5 seconds. One larceny every 4.8 seconds. And finally, one auto theft. Under every 30 seconds, I guess it's 28.8 seconds. Now, let's look a little bit here at some of the changing trends and patterns of crime. This comes from UCR data, again from the FBI. The curves here are showing violent crime from 1960 to 2010. And you can see the broad pattern in violent crime crime going up beginning in the 1960s, 70s, well into the 80s, and peaking out roughly in 1990. We were going through an explosion in violent crime, although not all violent crimes increased equally. For example, we saw big increases in aggravated assault, that's this curve here, in robberies, not nearly as much in forcible rape or in murder, although I will point out that homicide rates did go up during most of that period. This graph again illustrates that some violent crimes are a lot more common than others. The higher the curve is, the more of that particular type of crime. So not that many murders, very low to the bottom of the graph, not so many rapes, quite a few robberies, even more assaults. The larger trend, though, clearly shows crime rates peaking out the late 80s, early 90s, and then falling precipitously over the last few decades. Here we have property crimes, and while the patterns are a little different, they're somewhat similar. Once again, we can see that some property crimes are more common than others. The top curve there is showing an estimate for all property crimes, a property crime index, and you can see that property crimes began rising in the 1960s, peaked out in the around the mid-80s, early 80s, and then began to fall. So the timing of the fall is a little different. But nevertheless, you see this same general upward expansion in crime followed by a prolonged decline. You see similar patterns for larceny and theft, for burglary, and for auto vehicle theft. Again, you have a lot more larceny and theft than you do burglary, which in turn is more common, more frequent than motor vehicle theft. By the way, if you're looking at these graphs, they may be a little misleading because it makes it look like you have almost the same rate of property crime and violent crime. Don't be fooled. Look at the numbers along the sides here. 50, 100, 150, 200. 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. The scaling is different on this one. In other words, it kind of pushed this one down, compressed it. So actually, it makes these numbers or curves look very similar, when in fact there is a lot more property crime than there is violent crime. Now, again, I want to point out that that we did see this huge precipitous drop in both property crime and violent crime, beginning somewhere in the 80s, and for violent crime, maybe the 1990 and onward, we see continued declines. At the time, most criminologists did not predict that. In fact, many criminologists during this period were, during the 1980s and 90s, were expecting crime rates to continue to go up. A lot of them were projecting crime rates to rise. Instead, crime rates fell, and they keep falling year after year, decade after decade. The question, of course, is why? Why did they blow the prediction? Why did they get it wrong? We're still trying to unscramble that egg. We're still trying to figure that out. But we have a lot of suggestions. We threw more people in jail. Maybe the illegal drug market began to kind of stabilize, and you no longer had some of the crack cocaine wars like you had in the late 80s, early 90s. Presumably there were still other reasons, many other reasons, that eventually began to drive crime down. In fact, crime rates have continued to fall in the recent past. Here we have crime rates down. According to the FBI's latest crime in the United States report, violent crimes and property crimes declined during 2009 compared to the same period in 2008. Here you see a substantial decline in murder, rape to a lesser degree, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny and theft, and a huge decline in in motor vehicle theft and also in arson. So even during the worst part of our recession, we continued to see crime rates falling, even a lot of property crimes. A lot of people think that, well, crime is determined by economic conditions, increases in unemployment, poverty, economic recessions, and so forth. A lot of people assume those are going to push up crime rates, and in some cases they do. But in a lot of cases they don't, and this is a classic example. Whatever has been forcing crime rates down over the course of the last few decades wasn't interrupted, it wasn't stopped by our recent economic downturn. Now, in the last few years, we have seen a little bit of an uptick. Let's project this down where you can see it a little bit better. Here we see a more recent story from Fox News. Violent crime jumps 18% in 2011, the first rise in nearly 20 years. Let's just focus on that first one. The first rise in nearly 20 years. Falling, falling, falling. Here we're looking at violent crime rates, and you can see from 95 all the way to 2010, you can see this precipitous decline. But then, at the tail end, you see it whip back up again. Now, whether this is the beginning of a new increase in crime is anybody's guess. But that huge increase, that 18% increase in a single year, may sound stunning, but part of the reason that number is so big is because crime rates were so low by that time. Way back in, 1993, crime rates were, violent crime rates were close to 80 per 100,000 people. Violent crimes, again, 80 per 100,000 people per year back in 1993. By 2010, we're looking at down to 22. So even a fairly small uptick in a much smaller number produces a large percentage increase. So in that respect, it's probably not as bad as it looks like. And while I don't have the figures here to show you, more recent figures I've seen over the course of the past couple months, last year, suggest that violent crime rates probably aren't increasing rapidly in most parts of the country. Now, one last thing we'll point out in terms of broad crime patterns in America for this part of this video, we're going to look a little bit about how America, the United States, compares to other countries in terms of our crime rates. And the bottom line is simple. Compared to most other industrialized countries, America has lots of crime, and that's especially true for violent crime. In a lot of ways, America compares more to third world countries, to developing countries. In fact, we have a lot more crime, a lot more violent crime than quite a few other developing countries, countries that are less economically and technologically developed than us. And here you can kind of glance at some data for homicide rates, rape, robbery, burglary, and auto theft. And I'm just going to invite you to kind of glance over it. If you do look at it, what you're going to see is that most other industrialized countries, countries like Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, England, Finland, you get the idea, Denmark, those kinds of countries typically have much lower rates of crime, and again, that's especially true for violent crime. Now, I will warn you that this data is a little old. In fact, it's quite old. It's about 10 years old. Over 10 years old, because a lot of it comes from 2001. Part of that is because compiling comparable international data sets where you can compare homicide rates and rape rates across a wide range of different countries, a lot of times that takes a lot of time and resources. So a lot of times when you see these figures, they're way behind the time. But you know, there is some good news here. Crime rates in the United States have fallen a lot. That's especially true for violent crimes and to a large degree for property crimes as well. General rule of thumb is that property crimes have decreased maybe half as much as violent crime rates have decreased in the United States. Maybe a little more than that. At any rate, crime is way down in America. And frankly, a lot of other industrialized countries have seen their crime rates rise during the same period. So the numbers that are shown here aren't quite as bad as they look. If you look at numbers today, again, the United States might look a little better. But even today, we would still have violent crime rates that dwarfed most other industrialized countries. Well, we're going to talk more about trends and patterns in crime in the very next part of this video.